Welcome to Heavenly Story Time. We are going to be reading a story, but first we're going to be reading the Bible, Psalm 119. Then we're going to be reading, and then we're going to be doing something. Sorry, not reading. And then we're going to be reading. I forget what the book's called.
That's okay.
New book.
Miracle on 34th Street.
Okay, Miracle on 34th Street. Hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell, and then miss another video for Steve here. And here's my dad.
Hello! How are you doing today? We are on verse 25 of Psalm 119. Remember, we're just reading the sections of this one. Since it's such a long chapter, we're going to read it in parts. Maybe later we'll read the whole thing all together, but not today. All right, so this next section is with the Hebrew letter Daleth. And I apologize if I pronounce any of these wrong. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so there we go. My soul clings to the dust. Give me life according to your word. When I told of my ways, you answered me. Teach me your statutes. Make me understand the way of your precepts, and I will meditate on your wondrous works. My soul melts away for sorrow. Strengthen me according to your word. Put false ways far from me, and graciously teach me your law. I have chosen the way of faithfulness. I set your rules before me. I cling to your testimonies, O Lord. Let me not be put to shame. I will run in the way of your commandments when you enlarge my heart. The next 8 verses are hey, or as JJ says, he, but it's probably hey. And let me begin that one. Teach me, O Lord, the way of your statutes, and I will keep it to the end. Give me understanding that I may keep your law and observe it with my whole heart. Lead me in the path of your commandments, for I delight in it. Incline my heart to your testimonies, and not to selfish gain. Turn my eyes from looking at worthless things, and give me life in your ways. Confirm to your servant your promise, that you may be feared. Turn away the reproach that I dread, for your rules are good. Behold, I long for your precepts. In your righteousness give me life. And the next one is wow. Let your steadfast love come to me, O Lord, your salvation according to your promise. Then shall I have an answer for him who taunts me, for I trust in your word. And take not the word of truth utterly out of my mouth, for my hope is in your rules. I will keep your law continually forever and ever, and I shall walk in a wild place, for I have sought your precepts. I will also speak of your testimonies before kings, and shall not be put to shame. For I find my delight in your commandments, which I love. I will lift up my hands toward your commandments, which I love, and I will meditate on your statutes. And we're going to do one more today, Zion. Again, I don't know if that's the way that you're supposed to pronounce it. Zion or Zayin. Remember your word to your servant, in which you have made me hope. This is my comfort in my affliction, that your promise gives me life. The insolent utterly deride me, but I do not turn away from your law. When I think of your rules from of old, I take comfort, O Lord. Hot indignation seizes me because of the wicked who forsake your law. Your statutes have been my songs in the house of my sojourning. I remember your name in the night, O Lord, and keep your law. This blessing has fallen to me, that I have kept your precepts. And we'll begin with Heth tomorrow when we read the next 3 chapters of our story. So, now we are on Miracle of 34th Street. We started that book the last time, and we read the first 3 chapters. So, this is the story in which there is a gentleman, and I think he thought he was the Easter Bunny, and because he thought he was the Easter Bunny, he decided to fly all the way to Easter Island, and that is where we left off, when he was arriving at Easter Island. Here's Kimberly to say how it really happened.
That's actually a good story starter. Okay, there was this person, and he thought that he was Santa Claus. Now, everybody else was like, but that's absurd. Santa isn't real. Sorry my hair's a bit messy. I just took a bath. But they were, like, criticizing him and everything. My gosh, he can't be Santa Claus. This guy's mad. He's, like, crazy. He needs to be put in an asylum. So, they were gonna kick him out of the area because he was mad and everything.
He was in an old folks' home, and they were gonna kick him out because they couldn't take him because he was cuckoo.
Yeah. And
Or was he?
yeah. So, he goes over to his friend who runs like a zoo.
He works at the zoo.
Yeah. He works at a zoo, and he was gonna go stay over there with his friend for a while, till he can get enough money to buy an apartment or something. And so, as he goes over there, talks to his friend and everything, and he's walking around and he sees this float parade getting ready to go out, and he sees the Santa Claus practicing whipping the reindeer and everything, and he shows him how to do it right, and then he smells something odd. And then he sees a bottle of, like...
Something.
Yeah, a bottle of something that the Santa Claus was drinking. And he goes over to get the person in charge, but the person in charge was going to go over and talk to Santa anyway. She saw the bottle of whatever it was and was like, "You're fired." Right on the spot. No question asked.
Yeah, you're fired. Right as the parade's about to begin.
Yeah, like minutes before the parade begins. And then they, after a bit of deliberation, they get Kris Kringle. His name was actually Kris Kringle, to be Santa. And he's, he was like, "No, I don't think I should." And then he looks over at the kids and he's like, "I can't disappoint all these kids. They're hoping to see Santa. I can't disappoint them."
And they'll see the real one.
And then the next chapter, they cut to the person in charge of the parade. She goes over to her apartment, and they did a thing where was it her or her?
Her daughter really believes in Santa, right?
No.
And she's over at her friend's house that doesn't believe in Santa, and he thinks that it's all just a bunch of hogwash, right?
Yeah, she's the one who doesn't believe in Santa.
Oh. But she's like a teenager or something, right? Like
No.
17?
She's a little kid.
Oh, she's 6.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I'm gonna hand it off to Dad, who's gonna read us a story.
But guess what? I believe in Santa.
Hi, I'm back. I'm also front. Okay. So, now we're going to start with chapter 4. And this is just a fun little book. It's only like 100 and something pages. So, all right. And
Who wrote it?
Valentine Davies.
Thank you, somebody, for showing up.
You're welcome.
Valentine Davies wrote this book.
My
So-
mom is making hats right now.
Okay. All right. Chapter 4. Are we settled? Okay, keep going. I'm still told. All right, chapter 4. Early the next morning, looking very smart and businesslike, Mrs. Walker entered her office at Macy's. There sat Chris, waiting patiently to see her. Doris was the personnel director of the store, and Mr. Shellhammer, head of the toy department, had suggested that Chris be given a permanent job at Macy's Santa Claus. As Macy's Santa Claus. For Chris had made a tremendous hit at the parade and the ceremonies which followed. He was by far the most authentic Santa Claus that they had ever found. Mr. Shellhammer was most enthusiastic. This man was incredibly convincing. He would boom the toy department's sales immeasurably. Chris told Doris that he would be very happy to accept the job. Doris hired him instantly, grateful for having one headache less this year, for the Santa Claus had always been a problem. The salary and other details did not seem to interest Chris. Doris buzzed for her assistant, Miss Adams, who took him to her office and asked him to fill out an employment card. Chris sat down and filled out the form in a clear, Spencerian hand. Name, Chris Kringle. Address, Maplewood Home, Great Neck, Long Island. Age, as old as my tongue and a little bit older than my teeth. He handed the card to Miss Adams. She glanced at it mechanically as she turned and started for Mrs. Walker's office. Thank you, Mr. Kringle. Mr. Shellhammer's waiting for you. Mr. Shellhammer took Chris to the locker room to change into his Santa Claus outfit. While he dressed, Shellhammer handed Chris a list of the stock of the toy department. He had checked the particular items which were to be pushed this year. Chris nodded understandingly, and from the few remarks he made, he seemed to have an amazing knowledge of Macy's toys. Mr. Shellhammer emphasized the fact that if a child asked for something they did not carry, Chris was to suggest an item which they did want to, or that which they wanted to push. Mr. Kringle nodded silently, almost grimly. He knew exactly what Mr. Shellhammer meant. As soon as he left, Chris tore the list into very small pieces. Enthroned on the dais, with a long line of eager kiddies waiting to see him, Chris was really in his element. He loved every minute of it, and so did all the boys and girls. There were many remarks among parents about how very real this Santa Claus seemed. Everything was perfect. Mr. Shellhammer looked out of his office and beamed happily. "And what do you want for Christmas?" Chris asked, as the little boy climbed up on his ample lap. "I want a fire engine," the youngster replied, "the kind that's got real hoses that squirt real water, and I promise not to squirt it in the house, only outside in the yard." Behind the boy's back, his mother was frantically gesturing for Chris not to promise delivery on the fire wagon. But Chris paid no attention. "All right, Sonny," he said. "I'm sure you're a good boy. You'll get one." Delighted, the child climbed down. Now it was the mother's turn to say a word or two. She was fuming, but spoke quietly so the boy could not hear. "Why did you tell him that? They're not making that kind of fire engines. I've looked everywhere." "Oh, but you can get them," Chris replied, "at the Acme Toy Company at 246 West 26th Street. They're $8.50. Wow, $80 back then would be a fortune. They're $8.50, a real bargain." The woman stared in amazement. She couldn't believe her ears. Was Macy's Santa Claus sending her to another store? Chris replied that he certainly was, and he couldn't see anything particularly strange about it. After all, the important thing was to make the kiddies happy, and whether Macy's or Acme sold the toy didn't make any great difference. And so Chris continued as child after child climbed upon his lap. His only thought was for the youngsters. He wanted to be sure each boy and girl would get his wish at Christmas. If the toys seemed too expensive or Macy's didn't carry them, Chris told the mother just where she could get a less expensive train for Johnny, or where she would find just the right doll for Judy. The parents were inevitably both surprised and pleased. It was unfortunate, therefore, that Mr. Shellhammer should have overheard Mr. Kringle advising a little boy's mother to go to Gimbel's for his skates. Gimbel's, of all places. Mr. Shellhammer went into a mild state of shock. As soon as he regained his self-control, he started for Mrs. Walker's office. He was determined to have Kringle fired right away. This was simply inconceivable. If word of it ever got back to Mr. Macy, the Lord only knew what would happen. But as he proceeded through the store, he was stopped by a number of grateful mothers. They couldn't thank him enough for this tremendously helpful service. Instead of being merely commercial, Macy's Santa was actually being helpful to parents. It's a wonderful thing. The real Christmas spirit. They would never forget it. They would be regular Macy customers from now on. Mr. Shellhammer began to wonder. He stopped off at his own office, and there were many grateful messages and notes. Mr. Shellhammer sat down at his desk to think things over. Perhaps his first reaction had been wrong. "I think it's a wonderful idea," his secretary told him as she delivered another batch of notes. "You think so? And the women think so," he said sadly. "But will Mr. Macy think so?" He looked beseechingly toward the ceiling, but the answer was not there. Chapter 5. Fred had a date to take little Susan out that afternoon, and still disturbed by her precociousness, he was hatching out a deep-dyed plot. He would take Susan to see the new Santa Claus at Macy's. That gentleman would worm out of her a Christmas wish, and Fred would arrange to have it under the tree. Perhaps then Susan might believe in Santa Claus, or at least begin to have some normal childlike wonder. Fred managed to get to Chris and enlist his aid, but when Susan reached the head of the line and Mr. Kringle took her upon his lap, she refused to ask for anything. Whatever she wanted, her mother would get for her, provided, of course, it wasn't too expensive. She told Chris he was merely a gentleman her mother had employed this year to play the part of Santa Claus. "You are a little better than most," said Susan. "Anyway, your beard looks real." Mr. Kringle answered that it was real, and that he was real too, but he could get nowhere with the child. Chris was baffled and troubled. This was just the sort of thing he feared was happening in the world. As luck would have it, Doris emerged from her office just as this was going on and started walking briskly toward the elevator. She glanced toward the dais and then stopped dead. There was her daughter on Santa Claus' lap. Fred saw her approaching and looked a little sheepish. There was no scene at all. Doris was brusque and definite. She quickly whisked Susan away from Chris and planted her in the chair near the office. Then she asked Fred to step inside. From her vantage point, Susan watched Chris as he took a little girl with golden pigtails upon his lap. Her foster mother was explaining to Chris that the child had only recently arrived from an orphanage in Holland. She spoke hardly a word of English, but the wide-eyed child had insisted that Sinterklaas, as she called him, should speak Dutch. The girl was confidently talking away to Chris, and her mother's anguish was obvious. She started to explain to the girl, but Chris raised his hand for silence, and when the child had finished, he answered her in fluent Dutch. The sudden light which warmed the little Dutch girl's eyes did a funny thing to Susan. She stood there fascinated as Chris and the girl happily sang a little Dutch Christmas song together. There was something very real about this Santa Claus, and it puzzled her considerably. Inside her office, Dora had minced no words with Fred. She appreciated his interest and kindness toward her daughter, but Susan was still her responsibility to bring up as she saw fit. Whether Fred agreed with her or not, she insisted that he respect her wishes regarding the child. Fred took the scolding he knew he deserved. He promised not to repeat the performance if Doris would let him go on being friends with Susan. Very contritely he said good night to Susan and Doris and departed. As soon as Susan was alone with her mother, she began asking questions about Mr. Kringle. Doris carefully explained that he was just an employee of the store like the doorman or the elevator man or anybody else. "Yes, I know," said Susan, "but when he started speaking Dutch to that little girl, Mother—" "Susan, I speak French," said Doris patiently, "but that doesn't make me Joan of Arc." But Susan was not convinced. A shred of doubt still lingered in her mind. This Mr. Kringle had such a twinkle in his eyes. In order to clear up any confusion in her daughter's mind, Doris sent for Chris immediately. He entered with a jolly wink and a smile to Susan. "You're an employee of the store, aren't you?" she asked him. Chris nodded with mild surprise. "And you're not Santa Claus, of course, because there really is no such person." "Oh, I'm sorry to contradict you, Mrs. Walker," Chris replied, "but there certainly is, and here I stand to prove it." Susan's eyes opened wide. Her mother looked quite annoyed. No, you don't understand," she said. "I want you to be perfectly honest in front of the child." "I am being perfectly honest," said Chris. Doris tried another tack. "What is your name?" she asked him. "Kris Kringle." Doris pulled Chris's employment card from the file on her desk, and she suddenly stiffened. "Is there anything more I can tell you?" he was asking, but Mrs. Walker was really frightened now. No, thank you, she said hastily, as she ushered Susan from the room. This man really believed that he was Santa Claus. This gem that she had found might be a dangerous character. He seemed kindly and innocent enough, but who knew what other manifestations he might show, and he had been with countless children all day long. It was a wonder that nothing serious had happened. She had just found out in time. Quietly but firmly she gave Chris his notice. She wanted no trouble. She arranged to give him 2 weeks' pay. The old man didn't seem to mind. His only reaction seemed to be concern for Doris and little Susan. It was almost as if Doris were the one whose mental state was to be pitied. As Mr. Kringle walked out of the door, the phone rang. Mr. Macy wished to see her immediately. Doris entered the Holy of Holies with fear of trepidation. Had Macy found out that she'd hired a nut, and when she saw Mr. Shellhammer there as well, her heart skipped a few more beats. To her amazement, Mr. Macy congratulated both of them. Already word of Mr. Kringle's recommendations had reached him. Mr. Macy was being flooded with wires, phone calls, and messages of appreciation from grateful parents. This was the biggest goodwill idea that had ever hit the store. Why, it was revolutionary. Macy's Santa recommending gimbals. The results were bound to be phenomenal. He intended to make it the policy throughout the store. The store with the real Christmas spirit. It was tremendous. A brand new departure in merchandising policy, and Macy's would reap the harvest of publicity and goodwill. They must by all means keep this Santa Claus. Perhaps they could even find some other work for him after the holidays. Mr. Macy was delighted. He promised both Doris and Shellhammer immediate raises. Outside Mr. Macy's office, Doris shakily broke the news to Shellhammer. She had just fired their wonderful Santa. The old man was definitely crazy. Mr. Shellhammer exploded. They must get him back at once, before he left the store. If they didn't, all was lost. Doris said they could get another Santa Claus to carry out the same policy, but Mr. Macy had brought his grandson to see Kringle that afternoon, Shellhammer told her. He had been tremendously impressed. They must get Kringle back at any cost. After a frantic search, Doris finally caught Chris in the service elevator. She told him that she had reconsidered and that he still could have the job. But to her dismay, Mr. Kringle politely declined. "I'm afraid I don't like your attitude," he said frankly. Not Mr. Shellhammer's either. Frantically, Doris tried to explain that his genuine helpfulness and kindness had caused a sensation. "You must stay and keep on spreading goodwill. Why, even Mr. Macy—" Chris, however, was adamant. Mrs. Walker had clearly indicated her cynical disbelief. That was enough for him. But when Doris broke down and told him the whole story and explained that if he left it would mean her job, Mr. Kringle's whole attitude changed. If that were the case, he said, he would certainly stay. He couldn't have Mrs. Walker losing her job now, just before the holidays. Not just before the holidays, Think what that would mean to your lovely little daughter, he said, for Chris had begun to realize that Doris and little Susan were but unhappy products of their times. They presented a real challenge to him, a sort of test case for Santa Claus. If he could win them over, if he could get them to believe in him, then there was still hope. If not, Santa Claus and all he stood for were through. "You know, Mrs. Walker," he said, "for the past 50 years or so I've been more and more worried about Christmas. It seems we're all so busy trying to beat the other fellow in making things go faster and look shinier and cost less that Christmas and I are sort of getting lost in the shuffle." "Oh, I don't think so," said Doris. "Christmas is still Christmas." "No," said Mr. Kringle, shaking his head. "Christmas isn't just a day. It's a frame of mind. That's what's been changing. That's why I'm glad I'm here, because maybe I can do something about it." In spite of herself, Doris was impressed by Chris's warmth and kindness. She couldn't help liking the old man, even if he was a little off the beam. Chapter 6. The next morning, Chris was back on the dais once more, and everybody was happy. The line of children was longer than ever. Chris's reputation had already begun to grow. Word of mouth was spreading the news of the honest and kindly old gentleman at Macy's. But in Doris' mind there lingered a definite doubt and a worry. After all, she had employed him, and although he seemed harmless enough, she knew very little about the old man. He certainly had this delusion, and he might not be as harmless as he seemed. At any rate, she had better make sure. She studied his employment card again. Address, Maplewood Home, Great Neck, Long Island, it said. Just out of curiosity, Doris looked it up in the telephone book. To her surprise, she found that such a home was listed. Considerably encouraged, she called the place. But the results were hardly helpful. Yes, a Mr. Kringle had lived there, but he was away. Any questions concerning his physical and mental condition would have to be taken up with Dr. Pierce, the resident physician, but he too was away that day. Doris left a request for Dr. Pierce to call her, and hung up more concerned than ever. Somewhat reluctantly, and as a last resort, Doris called in Mr. Sawyer. Albert Sawyer was Macy's expert on vocational guidance and psychology, a pompous little gentleman who knew absolutely all the answers. Perhaps this sort of thing was not exactly in his field, Doris suggested hesitantly, but Mr. Sawyer assured her he was just the man. Why, he had made quite a study of abnormal psychology. He would be happy to interview this fellow and give her his opinion. So Chris was ushered into Mr. Sawyer's presence, and Sawyer proceeded to examine him. Mental tests were nothing new to Mr. Kringle. He knew them all by heart. He had passed them with flying colors a dozen times. Mr. Sawyer's questions were just like all the rest. Who was the first president of the United States? How much was 3 times 5? Chris answered them all as patiently as he could, but Sawyer's self-importance rubbed the old gentleman the wrong way, and the nervous, barking manner in which he asked the questions irritated Chris more and more. How was his eyesight? His hearing? Was his memory good? He went on and on. Now Sawyer held up 3 fingers in front of Chris's nose. How many fingers do you see? He asked. 3, answered Chris. And I see that you bite your nails, Mr. Sawyer. You're quite nervous, aren't you? Do you sleep well at night? That's no concern of yours, snapped Sawyer. How much is 3 times 5? 15, said Chris. You asked me that before. Nervous habits like yours are often the result of insecurity. Are you happy at home, Mr. Sawyer? This was more than Sawyer could stand. Chris had apparently touched a sore spot. That will be all, Mr. Kringle, he said coldly. You may go. Thank you, said Chris as he rose. And take it easy, Mr. Sawyer. Get out in the fresh air more. Get some exercise. Relax. Doris returned from lunch to find Dr. Pierce waiting to see her. She was delighted to see him. There was something reassuring in his easy, quiet manner. He had come to talk about Mr. Kringle. He had seen Chris's picture in the paper, and was delighted to learn that the old gentleman had found this job. There were just a few things, however, that Doris ought to know. Chris had some definite peculiarities. Yes, said Doris. We found that out. They're absolutely harmless, Dr. Pierce assured her. There are thousands of people leading perfectly normal lives who have similar mild delusions, like that fellow who claims he's a Russian prince. He's been proven wrong time after time, but nothing has ever shaken his story. And look at him, he's a highly respected and successful restaurateur in Hollywood. The doctor had known and loved Chris for a long time. All Doris's fears were absolutely groundless, he assured her. Mr. Kringle is incapable of harming anyone, he explained. His delusion is for good. He just wants to be friendly and helpful. The doctor's only concern was for the old man's welfare. He wanted to be sure that Chris was all right. It would be a little better, I think, if someone would keep an eye on him. I mean, after working hours. You know, Chris is a very old man, and I hate to think of him wandering about New York all alone. Doris was grateful and relieved. She promised Dr. Pierce that this would be done. Mr. Sawyer wore an imposing frown as he entered Mrs. Walker's office with Mr. Shellhammer. This man has a definite, fixed delusion, Sawyer told her. Doris knew that, but the doctor from Maplewood Home had just convinced her that he was perfectly sweet and harmless. But Sawyer was not convinced. He could not be sure from one examination. Cases like this often become violent when their delusion is attacked. Mr. Sawyer had made a special study of them. If this man were kept on here, he could take no responsibility in this matter. Doris said she would, then. She was certain that Dr. Pierce knew what he was talking about. Sawyer rose to leave. I warn you, then, Mrs. Walker, that I wash my hands of the whole affair. If this man grows violent, if something happens, the responsibility will be entirely yours. In spite of this warning, Doris and Shellhammer agreed that as far as Mr. Kringle was concerned, their worries were over. All that was necessary was for someone to keep an eye on him, sort of take custody of him. I think that's a splendid solution, said Mr. Shellhammer, and of course you're just the person to do it, Mrs. Walker. Oh, no, said Doris, shaking her head. I live all alone with my daughter. How can I have him stay with me? Well, said Shellhammer thoughtfully, my boy's away at school. We do have an empty room. Wonderful, said Doris, but I'll have to arrange it with Mrs. Shellhammer first, and that will take a little doing. I'll tell you what. If you'll take him home to dinner tonight, I'll talk to my wife and call you up later. And so it was agreed. And that is the end of Chapter 6. We'll read Chapter 7 tomorrow, and I hope that you're enjoying the story, The Miracle on 34th Street. And we will continue this tomorrow. Like I said, this is just a short book. We're on our second video, and we should have 6 total. So this one's going to be quick and short. I've already started posting them to YouTube. When I post them to YouTube, if you watch them on YouTube, we also post a link to where you can find the book online. I found when I posted that link, I think that it is the full version of the story. There were a lot of like kid picture books that weren't the full version of the story. It was just like a picture book or whatever. And at first I thought that it was out of print, and I was posting a link to Thrift Books. But I think I found one on Amazon that is the full version of the story. Also, I've got a link. Usually I use the link to Bible Hub, but Bible Hub would either give you a verse or a chapter, and since we're doing we're doing 24 verses yesterday, and today we've got 36 verses. So I used Bible Gateway because they'll actually do the exact passage. So there's links to all of the reading that we do on the YouTube when we post it. So that I should get it posted tonight. I don't have any other announcements at this time. We did get in the next book that we're going to be reading, and we'll be beginning that as soon as we're done with Miracle on 34th Street, and I'm looking forward to it, and I know you are as well. So God bless you. I hope you have a great evening, and we will see you here again tomorrow reading Miracle on 34th Street. Good night.